Well, welcome again to everybody from many countries who are on this retreat on the Aidan and Hilda week in the holy island of Lindisfarne. And this evening's talk might be the most boring because have any of you ever been in a church where the pastor you love or the vicar or the minister or whoever you love has left and the new one comes and you don't like his new ways and there's a lot of quarrelling and more management and it's less human and spontaneous than what you remember, and you've got to live under this regime and try and make it work the best you can, or you've got to leave and you can't make up your mind which to do. If any of you we've experienced that, and sometimes it happens with the church of a whole nation. And you get a new bishop or archbishop or pope or whatever, and people say, oh gosh, I can't cope with this. Well, bring back the old days. Well, the three lads I'm talking about today were three of the 12 Anglo-Saxon boys who Aidan recruited in the first year of his monastery school at Lindisfarne. But they come into their own after Aidan died in 651 and after in 664 all the Irish monks on Lindisfarne left to go back to Ireland. They were so disgusted by all the new Roman regulations brought into their church. And 30 of the English, as I said before, left Lindisfarne and went to Ireland. And people say that's the end of the Celtic influence. But was it? Far from it, because look at all these Saxon boys that Aidan had trained. Look at all the spiritual foster mothers he trained who were still in place. And today we talk about three of his lads at his first school, Cedd, Cedd and Boisil. Boisil actually might be an Irish name, and some people think he might have been one of the Irish Aidan brought, but that's by the way in a sense. But what happened? They didn't go back, they stayed on in their posts. And before too long, Oswy, who was the nominal Christian king, half-brother of St. Oswald, appointed Cedd to be a bishop of York. Now, Cedd was one of 4 brothers, and he was the brightest of the lot. And Bede tells us that he went for his further education to Ireland. And the Irish gave free board, free food, free lodging, and free tuition for up to 3 years to these poor English Saxon types who were doing it because they needed to do it. And there was this wonderful hospitality that the Irish afforded to people over the seas. And I hope that we can always remember that, and in our time we British can reciprocate this hospitality to the Irish. Well, we know that Cedd was very able, but he was also very holy and really took seriously Aidan's teachings. So he was made Bishop of York. The reason he was made bishop was Wilfrid, the Putin of the church, had gone to Rome, but he stayed not 1 year, not 2 years, but 3 years. And people said, he doesn't care a damn about us. We haven't got a bishop. And they complained, and the king said, well, we must put Cedd in. And then, so he became bishop, and we don't know what he did, but we can assume he was much loved. But after a time, Wilfrid came back and he said, you can't have him there, it's my post. And so Archbishop Theodore, who was a good guy, a Syrian, who was made Archbishop of Canterbury, said, well, I'm awfully sorry, old boy, to Cedd, but you can't be bishop anymore. And also, you have to have 3 bishops to make you a proper bishop from different countries, and you only had 2 from Britain, so you weren't properly consecrated. And Wilfrid has reminded me of this little fact, and so you were never a proper bishop. So now, I don't know how you'd react to that treatment. I'd storm out and complain to the ombudsman, I think. But there wasn't an ombudsman to complain to. But what Cedd said was, "Oh, I never thought I was worthy in the first place." And he was only too happy to stop being bishop. But Archbishop Theodore, who was present and who told him all this, was so impressed by his humility, his Christ-likeness, and his willingness, really, to be of service in any way possible. Shortly after that, he said, look, there's a vacancy for a new bishopric because the Mercians, Midlanders, you Coventry and Birmingham lot, had been open to the gospel, and it was having churches planted, and they needed a bishop, an overseer for the whole thing. And he said, I would like to make you the bishop of Mercia. And he agreed. But Cedd followed Aidan's practice of walking everywhere because he thought it was so important to befriend everybody, not to be above people. He wanted to be with the poor. And he kept this practice up. But Archbishop Theodore was rather wise. He said, there are far more people in this area than there were, and you are that much older. And he said, I think you should ride a horse. And he helped him up physically onto the horse. So he had to ride the horse. But it was a rather loving thing to do. And then Cedd had to decide how to bring Christ to this large new area. And he decided not to build a great big cathedral with huge towers and glittering icons and things, but to build a group of prayer cells. And the heart of his diocese would be a heartbeat of prayer cells. Hermits or people who reached out to the people, but they prayed all day when they were free and prayed when they were walking. And so this was the heartbeat. And I was reminded of this in the United States of America. The church has broken away from the Episcopal Church, and it called itself the Anglican Church, just to confuse everybody. It's not like the Anglican Church here. So it's the Anglican Church in America, and they set up dioceses with bishops. And one of these bishops came here over Christmas and stayed in our house, Shalom. And he said, what I'm seeking God for over Christmas is how to have a hearth for our new diocese. And he said, I think instead of a cathedral, we're going to have a prayer house, and we're going to call it St. Aidan's Prayer House. And that reminded me of St. Cedd and how he went about having a hearth for his diocese. Well, he did a wonderful work, and he recruited people to being holy, which is a different thing necessarily to the Crystal Cathedral approach. And one day there was a lot of thunder and lightning, and he would lie down prostrate on the floor when it thundered. And people said, why do you do this, Bishop? Why do you pray like that? And he said, well, he quoted Psalm 18, God sends wind, lightning and thunder to excite us peoples to fear him, to humble their pride and make them aware that they will be judged. So he took the creation, the voice of God in the thunder, as a sign that he had to lie prostrate on the floor and beg pardon for his sins and the sins of the people. It's rather quaint in some ways, but it's rather beautiful. And of course he came to the end of his life, but one day a brother heard sweet singing come from the highest point of the winter sun through the roof of the cell where Cedd was praying until it filled it. And after half an hour he heard the same joyful sounds return with unspeakable sweetness into the sky. And as he was wondering what this meant, Bishop Cedd came to the windows and clapped his hands, as was his custom when he wanted people to come and hear him. He told Owini to bring all the 7 brothers whom he urged to live in love and peace and to follow the rule taught by Aidan, so they followed Aidan's rule still, with unwearying constancy, and to follow the example that the ancient spiritual fathers, meaning the Irish, had set them, and the early Desert Fathers and the early Christians. And then he told them that the amiable guest, meaning the plague, would come for him in 7 days. So he was prophetic too. Commend me to God and prepare yourselves also to be ready to meet your God at any time, he told them. 7 days later, he did indeed die, and one of the brothers saw Cedd's deceased elder brother Cedd coming with angels from heaven to greet him. This was in 672. So it was 21 years after Aidan died, and quite some years after the Synod of Whitby had introduced the Roman regulations. Now, instead of giving you all the spiritual exercises at the end, I'm going to give you one now on Cedd.
Oh, right, okay. This is new.
Cedd was sacked by power-hungry prelates. He had the humility to accept this. The Archbishop was so impressed that he made him bishop of a much bigger area. What disappointments or setbacks have you suffered, or do you fear? Try to root out possessiveness until you are as free as the wind. Have you got that?
I think you might need to say it.
Cedd humbly accepted dismissal, saying, I was never worthy of this in the first place. The Archbishop was so impressed that he made him bishop of a larger area. What disappointments or setbacks have you suffered, or do you fear? Try to root out possessiveness until you are free as the wind. Well, now Cedd's legacy is partly in the St Chad's Gospels, as they're called, which are in Lichfield Cathedral. There's a bit of a war between some of the Welsh in St Tyler's who claim that they did the Gospels, and others who say a monk of Lindisfarne did the Gospels and dedicated them to St Chad. Lichfield Cathedral denies any Welsh claim, and Pat Bancroft, who's on the staff there, is sure a monk trained in Lindisfarne wrote the book in Lichfield in 700 AD. It visited Wales briefly, at which point marginalia was probably added in Welsh, but she is sure that they were written here at the time of Cedd's death and were brought here quite legally, and they were given to the bishop in AD 900. Well, and then Cedd's relics were deposited at a place called Dundrain, which may refer to Dundroegni by the River Tay, if my pronunciation is correct, or Scots correct, where local tradition believed people venerated his grave. Now, I'll come up to the River Tay, which is where the Highlands of Scotland begin, when we come to Cedd. So that's Cedd. Now, he had an elder brother called Cedd, and they're in the original Irish, they're almost the same spelling, which is very confusing. Cedd also was one of the 12 pupils, the first 12 Saxons in Aidan's monastic school. So his life focused around Latin, prayer rhythms, chanting psalms, eating and fasting, practical gifts such as gardening, animal husbandry and so on. But Cedd developed a great skill in languages. Now it is thought that he spoke Irish, and he may have spent time in Ireland, and but it was Irish Gaelic, which they would speak along the Tay River. Not the Picts, but the others would do that. And he learned Latin as well as Saxon. He learned Pictish, which is another reason why we think he worked with Aidan along the Tay Valley, because there were Pictish communities there as well. So he learned Pictish, Gaelic, Irish and Latin. And when the Synod of Whitby was summoned in 664, they needed a translator, because some spoke in Latin, some came from the continent, didn't speak any Saxon, and so they had the Irish contingent, they spoke Gaelic. It was all very complicated. And so they asked Cedd to be the translator of the Synod of Whitby. And Bede, rather piously, says it was like Pentecost. Because a new Pentecost. I don't think it was really. It was the last thing to resemble Pentecost, because they were arguing and complaining and imposing. But nevertheless, because Cedd was so able at translating, they were able to discuss in many languages. It's speculated that Cedd was born about the year 612. And some think that his parents were actually in Northumbria and among the Saxon nobility, who went into exile with Oswald because they were kind of connected with the royals. That's speculation. But we certainly know that Aidan took Cedd and Chad and others, Saxon brothers, monks, to work in missionary work along the River Tay. And it can't really have been much before Aidan's mission began, because unless they were all exiles with Oswald, and Aidan got to know them that way and did this missionary work before coming to Lindisfarne. I think that is a possibility. So we don't know the dates. But the River Tay is near Abernethy, the Glen Lyon, and it comes south of Perth to the Pictish capital, and then goes out to St Andrews. And if you won't go by boat, you can go from St Andrews to Lindisfarne by boat. And there are three possible routes the people who came from Iona to Lindisfarne took. But the route I and Graham Booth and others think is much the most likely is along the River Tay. And then south by boat from St Andrews to Lindisfarne along the sea. And the Scottish writers, who are much later and therefore not as reliable as Bede, but they're very serious people, and they immerse themselves in local traditions. Charles Stewart and Duncan Campbell, part of the 19th century Celtic revival, and they studied works such as William Keane's Chronicles of the Picts, the Scots, and so on, so on, so on. And one tradition claims that the Fortingall Church, now Fortingall Church is along the River Tay, it has a yew tree that claims to be 4 or is it 5,500 years old? It claims to be the oldest yew tree in Europe. Yeah. And there are, others claim that the Pontius Pilate was stationed there when his father was in charge of a Roman legion, because they had diamonds there. So there are all sorts of these connections. And the Lairds of Glen Lyon and the Book of Garth and Fortingall claim that Cedd and his brother were in the region, and that Fortingall Church was originally dedicated to Sir Cedd, and that he was for a time the patron saint of Fortingall. His residence is claimed to be at Duneaves, at Tiganeum, if that's how you pronounce it, in that lovely nook formed by a bend in the Lion. The great Scottish poet Burns wrote a beautiful poem about that area. Between the house and the river is a field called Cedd's Field, and ancient artefacts have been discovered, including 2 Celtic period bells which are ascribed to Cedd or his brother Chad. It seems that he evangelised neighbouring districts, for at Foss, on the other side of the hill, is Polkiorden, is that how you pronounce it? Where he no doubt baptised people, and above Aberfeldy is Lonkierden, Cedd's meadow. These authors think it extremely likely that Cedd's remains were brought back to Fortingall and buried under the monumental stone slab at Teagnestrait on the opposite side of the River Tay to his house. Now, Aidan, the place now called Kentmore, was before that known as Aidan's Place, and it is generally believed by the Church of Scotland people that Aidan started the church in that place, which, or maybe en route to Lindisfarne, where he stayed for some months and gathered people, then moved on, and it then became the Church of Kenmore. And Duncan Campbell thinks that Cedd and Cedd both did what they could to protect the Picts and the Scots of Dalriada from the cruelties of King Oswy, because King Oswy, who was the nominal Christian half-brother of Oswald, although he bribed God to help him win victories, he was very cruel towards the people of Dalriada, who had been so kind to his family. And he repaid old protection with intrigue and hostility. And so they had a very diplomatic and very delicate role of trying to protect those people from the hostilities of Oswy, who wanted to extend his boundaries, be an empire builder. Well, Aidan was succeeded by Bishop Finan from Iona, and King Oswald was succeeded by Oswy. And Finan sent Cedd to assist in preaching and baptising the people of the Middle Angles. And that seems under King Piada, who wanted to marry Oswy's daughter. The astute king agreed on condition that they become Christians and allowed a mission to his people. So Cedd and Ada and Betty and an Irish priest called Duma were sent to Middle Angles, to evangelise them. So he was a great evangelist, and he was a prophetic man. He was an apostolic man, rather than Cedd, who didn't upset people and loved everybody and created stability. Cedd created a certain amount of instability, I would say. Mm-hmm. He was a great communicator, and he was very prophetic. Once when he was asked to then evangelise the East Saxons, what we call Essex area now. Now that had been partly evangelised earlier in a Celtic mission, and they'd had a Bishop Mellitus in 604 who ruled the East Saxons, and they dedicated a church to St. Paul. But after that, Sigebert became king, and then another Sigebert, and Oswy urged him to renounce pagan gods because there had been a return to paganism, and Maid of Merewood and convert to the true and living God. And so Sigebert asked for mission priests to convert his people, and Cedd was one of the key people to go. He was very prophetic. He told the king to stop committing adultery, and that if he didn't, he'd die, and the king fell down dead. And he upset another bigwig by condemning his bad practices. And we know he built churches at what is now called Bradwell and Tilbury. And then he converted a disused Roman fort for a church at a place called Athona. And pilgrims still gather by this place. The Athona community uses it. And if you go on the London Underground, you go to Southminster, Minster named after a monastery he founded. And then to the very last place you get off that line, you can walk to Bradfield, and the Athona old fort, which is a chapel. And he has a big stone from Lindisfarne there, as well as a big stone from Iona, to link it to the Celtic centres in the British Isles. And other sites that he may well have founded churches are West Mersey, Great Burstead, Prittlewell, Southminster and Upminster. Minster, of course, meaning monastery. And next to the Church of St Mary Magdalene, North Ockenden, is St Cedd's Well. A few years ago, a spectacular discovery was made at Prittlewell of a mid-7th century Saxon burial chamber, complete with Christian symbols. And it had the grave of the king, and it revealed the dead king's faith. It was revealed not only by the crosses, but by the remarkably small amount of jewellery, because Christians avoided ostentation. So the simplicity of Aidan was still carrying on in some of the spirituality. Now, sometime between 653 and 655, Cedd was given a piece of land in Northumbria's southern kingdom of Deira in Yorkshire. There was a separate king of Yorkshire for a time. We had Oswin, the Christ-like man, was killed. He was succeeded by a cousin called Ethelwerd, who was also a Christ-like, devout son of the late King Oswald. And Ethelwerd asked Cedd to build a monastery in this rather remote place where prayers could be said, miracles could occur, and he could be buried. And it's interesting because Bede points out that Aidan had taught them to pray for 40 days over a place before they built. And so Cedd took this teaching of Aidan totally seriously, and he committed to pray for 40 days. But then because he was a bishop, he was called away to a sudden job. So he asked his brother Chad to come back and stay there until the 40 days were accomplished. It was very, very important. There was unceasing prayer for 40 days to saturate the land before they built the first stone. And if you go now, you go on a great pilgrimage to Lastingham, which you can go from Whitby at 50 minutes or something?
It's one of the really truly thin places.
It's a very, very thin place, and the Church of England Parish Church has steps which you can go down to the ancient crypt, which is the original cell, still there. It's very, it's a magic place to visit.
It is.
A very thin place.
What was it called?
Lastingham. Lastingham. And Bede describes it as isolated and inhospitable, and he quotes from the prophet Isaiah chapter 35 verse 7. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And indeed that all happened at Lastingham. So we ought to have a spiritual exercise on Cedd. What could that be? I wonder. It's this. Cedd laboured for God in the Tay and near the Thames. You can walk to the Thames from one of the churches he founded in 15 minutes. So it's not quite true to say he laboured right to the Thames, but he was pretty near the Thames. And it seems he returned to the Tay after leaving the Thames behind. He carried within himself sacred bonds from the Picts and the Gaels to the Essex man, as we call it today. The people who live in Essex are called the Essex man. He carried within him sacred bonds between very different peoples. What does it mean for you to be a carrier of sacred bonds? Well, of course, we're not all called to be missionaries travelling around the world, but you may have crossed some boundaries, or on the internet through connections there. But you're creating sacred bonds in people who are not alike, but who become alike. And Bede says that out of the warring kingdoms of Picts, Irish Scots, Saxons and Welsh, God made one people through the fellowship of the gospel as a result of Aidan's mission.
That's what they're for.
And Cedd was very much part of that creating of one people in the fellowship of the gospel, not obliterating distinctions, but creating a heart fellowship, delighting in differences because friendship is so deep.
Can we have the question again? What does it mean to you?
What does it mean to you to be a carrier of sacred bonds? So we could write a book about your answers. Wouldn't that be fun to have another retreat writing a book? Or all your answers. Wonderful. We could do it in that book. You've got a monastery on the front cover.
And then it could be translated into Icelandic.
Yes?
Yes.
Indeed it could. Well, now we come to the third of these three men, Boisil. Now, some think he was one of the original 12 Saxons, and Kate Tristram, who's a wonderful friend on the island, who's now 89. She was in church on Sunday, and she's a very learned lady. she thinks he might have been one of the Irish Aidan bought, because his Boisil is a slightly Irish name, but he's generally thought of as to being one of the Saxons. Anyway, if he was born in Northumbria, and he was trained in monasticism at Lindisfarne by St Aidan, and during this time of fervour he became a monk and quickly rose, because he was a good student, he knew Latin and all that. He studied the Bible, because the Bible was in Latin in those days. And he became prior of Melrose Abbey. That's not the Melrose of today, it's 3 miles down the river to Old Melrose. Worth a visit, it's a wonderful place to visit. And that's the original site of the monastery, and they've got a cafe there with lots of plaques up which describe what it looks like. So he became prior, and in Tweeddale, as it is today, under Abbot Eata. Bede tells us that the saint had sublime virtues as well as being an eminent scholar. He talked constantly of the Blessed Trinity. Now, I'm very keen on people who are in love with the Trinity. You see, evangelicals have divorced Christ from the Trinity. Some evangelicals, not all. But that's a great danger in evangelicalism. Christ is divorced from the Trinity. That's why we got all the Muslims in the world, because they think Christianity has got a second God. And he repeated the name Jesus Christ with tender affection. And he frequently exclaimed, "How good a Jesus we have!" And he wept so sincerely that onlookers were inspired to join him. So the human emotions were flowing in this man, but he was also a great student. And when Cuthbert, who will come on to another day, was Boisil told Cuthbert he was going to die, and he had the last week of his life he could spend with Cuthbert, because he realised Cuthbert was going to be a great leader. He said, "How would you like to spend it last week?" And Cuthbert said, "Studying John's Gospel." So he poured out his understanding. And it's interesting that at the Synod of Whitby, the Celtic people said, "We follow John," for the date of Easter, which was that what they thought, although it wasn't actually true. And the Romans said, "We follow Peter," which is what they thought, although it wasn't actually true, because neither Peter nor John had the same calculations that they had later. But the point is, the Eastern Orthodox follow John as their primary apostle. The Romans follow Peter as the first pope. And here we have the Celtic tradition also in love with John, because he reclined on Jesus' bosom and he was the apostle who was loved. It was all about love and communion, and John brings the Trinity to life in his gospel. So they were in love with the Trinity. This is very important. And they brought sick people and ailing people from far and near to be cured by his herbal remedies. So these Celtic Christians, they were a bit like, what do you call medicine today? Homeopathic medicine, do you? They were into that a bit, as well as prayer, of course. And they had various wells near. There's a place called Welbury Well in the bank just below Boisil's chapel, and the Hare, corruption of air, meaning holy, well, which lies near St Boswell's Burn, quite near where Kelso is. And quite a large community grew up there. Now Boisil used to go down the river, we assume, because the church near me, just over the bridge where I live in Berwick, is called St Boisil's at Tweedmouth. And so it seems quite possible that either he came up by boat and founded a monastery there, because it was on the route of the ancient Roman road going from the south up into what is now Scotland. So he either founded a church or they were influenced by Melrose and named it after him. A pope said it's not suitable to have a church not named after one of the 12 apostles. It isn't at all Roman. And so a pope said you've got to name it after an apostle, Bartholomew. But in 1975, the Anglican Bishop of Newcastle agreed that it could be dedicated to St Bartholomew and St Boisil. And there's a nice icon there of both Bartholomew and Boisil side by side, which is a rather nice partnership between the two traditions. And when Cuthbert arrived as a young man with a silk tunic, a sword, a horse and a servant, so he was still a Saxon nobleman and hadn't learned the ways of simplicity yet. He'd been moved by God to offer himself for life service, but he hadn't divested himself of everything. But anyway, he arrived, and Boisil greeted him at the door, and he said to the monk beside him, "Behold the servant of the Lord." He knew instantly that he was a man anointed deeply by God who would be a great leader. And Abbot Eata soon gave, so the abbot of Melrose was Eata, Boisil was the prior, the number 2 person who did all the organisation. He gave permission for Cuthbert to enter, and Boisil ensured that he watched, prayed, worked and read harder than anyone else, because they realised he had outstanding ability. He got a double first at Oxford, as I might say, and so he needed to be stretched to his ultimate, more than others who were less talented. They were stretched to their ultimate. Cuthbert must be stretched to his ultimate. So we learn there that Boisil stretched people to their ultimate, and I rather like that. And then in AD 659, Eata left the monastery to found a second monastery at Ripon in Yorkshire and took Cuthbert with him, which we'll learn about tomorrow, to be the guest master. But unfortunately, Wilfrid came back and said, "Oh, I want my Roman people in charge of all these places. You get out." And so Eata and Cuthbert go out and go back to the monastery. And Cuthbert, the plague came and Cuthbert was thought to be dying. And they had Boisil arranged for an all-night prayer meeting. You see, it's not just American revivalists who have all-night prayer meetings. They had all-night prayer meetings. And they had an all-night prayer meeting that the plague would not take Cuthbert away. And Boisil declared prophetically that he would most certainly recover. But then he also, and he prophesied that Cuthbert would one day be a bishop, which is, some say, the reason Cuthbert agreed to become a bishop, the only reason he agreed. And he also prophesied that he would die of the epidemic, of the plague, COVID or whatever it was. So Boisil died on the 7th of July 661 and was buried at Melrose, but miracles kept occurring at his tomb, and it led to the creation of a beautifully carved shrine which are preserved in the museum at nearby Jedburgh Abbey. Have you been there? I haven't. I must have a day off there. And he is also remembered in the name of St Goswell's, which has the best independent bookshop in the British Isles. Well, Boisil, I think, is a peacemaker, and in 1995 he was restored to the parish church. But he also appeared in a dream, as a peacemaker. He appeared to Northumbria's King Egfrith, who was a brutal man. Oh dear, sorry you can't see me. Hello. If you didn't see me, it's because
Don't worry about it.
the angels came. And he appeared to Northumbria's King Egfrith and warned him in a dream against attacking the Picts. Well, unfortunately, King Egfrith didn't heed his warning. But here you've got this spiritual warfare going on between the spirituality of people like Boisil, who was in the tradition of St Aidan, carrying forward the purity of faith, the prophetic outreach, the holiness of life, and the determination to be like Christ, in the midst of a political situation where they were crooks, the king was a crook, and a church situation where some of them were pretty much like, they were powermongers, if not crooks, powermongers in the church. So it was quite a depressing context in which he lived, but he continued to the very last day of his life to live like Christ and left a lasting legacy. So what is my spiritual exercise? Here it is. Boisil was a sought-after teacher, had his sublime virtues were talked about, and he always talked about the Holy Trinity and had prophetic insights for people. So which of these 4 gifts do you most long for? To be a teacher, the Trinity, the virtues, prophetic insight. Which of those 4 gifts do you most long for, and how can you cultivate them? Thank you for listening. God bless you all.